Hello everyone, and welcome to this online psychology lesson for Activate Learning. Today we'll be discussing the behaviourist perspective and how they explain human behaviour and learning. So the origins of the behaviourist perspective date back to 1913 from John Watson. Now he published an article that was titled Psychology as the Behaviourist Views It. Now the behaviourist approach has five main assumptions. These are that psychology should be a science, all behaviour is learnt from interactions with the environment, the focus should be on observable, measurable behaviour as opposed to any other factors. Animals and humans learn in the exact same manner, and therefore animals are appropriate to use within research. And then finally, behaviour is the result of a stimulus-response relationship. Now, the first of them, psychology as a science. Any theory within science needs to be supported by empirical evidence. Therefore, behavioural definitions should be operationalised within psychology. Operationalised means that a variable should have a strict definition of what constitutes as that variable and how it would be measured. Now, Watson is quoted as saying, "Psychology as a behaviourist views it is a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of human behaviour. Behaviourists believe that the mind is blank upon birth, and they call this the tabula rasa. So if in your own independent research you come across the term tabula rasa, it just means born a blank slate. Therefore, all behaviour is learnt from the environment. And the behaviourist perspective tends to exclude the influence of genetics in explaining human behaviour, as it's only observable behaviours that can be measured. So when it comes to actual learning, the behaviourist perspective explains that learning is through the process of something called classical and operant conditioning. So, observable, measurable behaviour. Behaviourists might often accept the existence of emotions or cognitions, however they are not the focus in research, as only observable, measurable behaviour can be scientifically measured. Therefore, all internal mental processes should either be explained in terms of behavioural psychology, or they should be disregarded completely. And animals versus humans. Now, animals learn the exact same way that a human does through classical and operant conditioning. Therefore, it is appropriate to use animals in research and to then extrapolate the findings and generalise them to the human population. You can see this in a lot of behaviourist research, as most of it is conducted on animals. Now, stimulus response. No matter how complex a behaviour is, the behaviourist believes that it can be broken down into a stimulus-response relationship. So Watson believed that the purpose of psychology was to predict the behaviour that would result in response to a stimulus, and also to predict the stimulus that caused behaviour in the first place. So to make that a little less confusing, if you look at the red diagram, you can see that a stimulus leads to a response that leads to a consequence, or an outcome. So the aim of psychology, according to Watson, would be to assume the stimulus based upon the response, or also what the response would be in accordance to the stimulus. So if we look to the diagram on the right, Watson would look to explain maladaptive alcohol behaviour as we see a stimulus such as stress within the person's environment, and then we are able to extrapolate that the behaviour they're most likely to engage in would be drinking. Now, he would also wish for psychology to be able to predict the stimulus that led to drinking behaviours in the first place, such as stress. Now, behaviourism can be split into two sections, methodological behaviourism and radical behaviourism. Watson was responsible for the development of methodological behaviourism. However, B.F. Skinner agreed with methodological behaviourism that the aim of psychology should be the prediction and control of behaviour. However, radical behaviourism accepts the existence of innate behaviours, such as sucking or grasping behaviours that you see in infants, and that is in contrast to the methodological behaviourists who believe that there is no innate behaviours and everyone is born as a tabula rasa. Now on to how the behaviourist perspective explains learning. So the first process is known as classical conditioning. This was first identified by the physiologist Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov was researching the salivation of dogs in response to food. He did this by surgically implanting test tubes to their cheeks to measure the levels of salivation that the dogs would produce. Now, he noticed something weird whilst conducting these experiments. When his assistant would walk into the room, the sound of the footsteps would actually cause the dogs to start salivating. Now, Pavlov sought to explain the stimulus-response relationship further. In his research, Pavlov set out to test his theory on his dogs using a bell and food, or a metronome and food. There are multiple variations of this experiment. Now, Pavlov measured the amount of salivation at each stage to assess the behavioural responses. Now, Pavlov did believe that there are some behaviours that a dog would not need to learn, such as salivation, as it is a biologically hardwired response. So we'll take a look at his experiment in a bit more detail now. So here we're going to look to explain classical conditioning using these key terms. Now, when a neutral stimulus is put into the environment, it has no effect on behaviour and produces no response. When a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus are paired together, it produces an unconditioned response. Now, an unconditioned response is a behavioural response to an unconditioned stimulus. When paired together, these produce a conditioned stimulus that then produces a conditioned response. To make it a little bit easier to understand, a neutral stimulus in the example of Pavlov's dogs would be that a neutral stimulus, such as the sound of a bell, produces no response within the dogs. However, when the bell is paired with an unconditioned stimulus, such as food, this leads to an unconditioned response, which is salivation. So once a bell and food are paired together, you have a conditioned stimulus. Now, the conditioned stimulus is the same as a neutral stimulus in that it is the bell on its own. So once paired together and an association is made between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, it produces the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, which has the same response as the unconditioned response. Therefore, the bell produces the behaviour of salivation. So a neutral stimulus leads to no response. A neutral stimulus plus an unconditioned stimulus produces the unconditioned response. And a conditioned stimulus is produced as a result of this pairing that then leads to the conditioned response. So in Pavlov's case, a bell was rung whenever the dogs were going to be fed. This did not produce any response within the dogs, as they had not associated it with anything at that time. Once the bell was added with an unconditioned stimulus of food, the dogs would start to salivate. Therefore, after many repetitions, as the key to classical conditioning is repetition, that comes between here and here, with many repetitions, a conditioned stimulus was formed where Pavlov would ring a bell and the dogs would immediately start to salivate as they associated the bell with food. So to summarize classical conditioning, it involves learning to associate an unconditioned stimulus, which already produces an unconditioned response, with a neutral stimulus in order to bring about the same response. Now, in terms of operant conditioning, this was developed by B.F. Skinner, as he viewed classical conditioning as being too simplistic to explain all human behaviour. The aspect of operant conditioning focuses on the consequences of behaviour, with certain consequences either increasing or decreasing the likelihood of behaviour occurring in the future. Skinner believed in the existence of the mind, but he believed it was more crucial to focus on measurable behaviour. So in terms of operant conditioning, we need to discuss reinforcement versus punishment. Skinner based operant conditioning on Thorndike's law of effect, and was responsible for introducing 3 new terms that describe behaviour into the law of effect. He named these neutral operants, which have no effect on behaviour, reinforcement, which is responsible for increasing the likelihood of behaviour from being repeated in the future, and punishment, which is responsible for decreasing the chances of behaviour being repeated. Let's have a look at how these 2 consequences influence behaviour. So if we look at operant conditioning, we have a positive and a negative. We then have reinforcement and we have punishment. Now, these form a grid, and what you'll notice is that reinforcement can either be positive or negative. When reinforcement is positive, it is known as positive reinforcement, and the same can be said for negative reinforcement. With punishment, it is the same rules: positive punishment or negative punishment. Now, it's important to understand these key terms, as they will be essential when it comes to writing assignments. Positive reinforcement is when anything is added to the environment to increase behaviour. So when looking at positive or negative, think about whether or not something was added to the environment or taken away. Now, with reinforcement, we want to increase behavior, and with punishment, we want to decrease it. So positive reinforcement adds something to the environment and increases behavior. Now with negative, something is taken away from the environment, but that increases behavior. A lot of people get confused with negative reinforcement and punishment. It is not the same as taking reinforcement away. It is simply removing something from the environment, usually a negative aversive stimuli, that increases behavior, such as removing chores to increase good behavior. With positive reinforcement, it could be allowing more time to play games as a result of doing chores. So it's adding something to the environment to increase behavior, or it is removing something from the environment to increase behavior. Positive and negative reinforcement. Punishment works the exact same way. So positive punishment adds something to the environment to decrease behavior. So an example could be grounding a child due to behavior that is deemed undesirable, because you add a consequence to the environment that will hopefully decrease that behavior. You can also do adding chores to a child's daily regimen as a result of negative behavior. So essentially, positive punishment is just about adding something to the environment to decrease behavior in the future. Negative punishment is removing something from the environment to decrease behavior, such as a child being rude, so their phone is taken away, or a child throws a tantrum in a shop, and as a result they have their privileges of coming to the shop with you taken away. So this is the grid that you need to know for operant conditioning. We have positive reinforcement, we have negative reinforcement, we have positive punishment, and negative punishment. Each of these are responsible for doing a certain thing to the environment to either increase or decrease behavior. So it's important to remember this grid, draw it out a couple of times just to make sure it's ingrained within your memory, but if you ever get stuck, just draw out a little cross like this, positive, negative, reinforcement, punishment. Try and figure out if something's being added or taken away from the environment, and whether or not you want the behavior to increase or to decrease. Now, research evidence for operant conditioning comes from Skinner conducting research of his own. Now, in Skinner's research, he used animals such as rats or pigeons and placed these animals into a structure that he created known as a Skinner's box. You can see one just here on the right-hand side. Now, when experimenting with reinforcement, Skinner would place rats or pigeons within the box. They would be presented with a neutral stimulus, and through exploration of the environment, the animal would produce the desirable behavior, such as pressing a lever. Now, the animal was then reinforced with a food pellet. In the instances of positive reinforcement, the animal would then begin to associate certain behaviors, such as pushing the lever, with a certain level of reward or reinforcement, such as receiving a food pellet. Now, Skinner performed many different variations of this experiment. For positive reinforcement, the rat would push the lever and as a result would be granted a food pellet as a reward. With negative reinforcement, the rat would be placed into a box with an electrified grid at the base. This would then be charged and the rat would be electrocuted to a level of discomfort. Now, the rat would then run around the box and accidentally press the lever. Now, pressing the lever would stop the electric shocks, and over time the rat started to learn that pushing the lever actually removed the aversive stimuli, such as the electric shocks, thus leading to evidence to support negative reinforcement, as the rat would perform a certain behavior in order to reduce or remove a certain stimuli from its environment. And research can be found that demonstrates both classical and operant conditioning, as research conducted by Watson and Rayner in 1920 demonstrated that phobias could be conditioned in humans through the use of an infant named Little Albert. Now, Albert was 9 months old at the beginning of this research, and unfortunately stayed until he was 11 months old before he was removed from the experiment. Now, in modern ethical guidelines, the experiment would be deemed as unethical. However, in the 1920s, the ethical landscape of psychology research was very different. So if we return to the explanation of classical conditioning, Watson and Rayner took little Albert and placed him in a room. Albert was then presented with some neutral stimuli, such as a rat, and this produced no response within Albert. However, Albert would react to a metal bar being struck behind his head, as it produced quite a loud noise. So Watson and Rayner set out to present the neutral stimulus, which was the rat, to Albert at the same time as hitting the bar. This produced a loud noise and produced an unconditioned response, which was fear. And in fact, Albert would often cry after the bar had been hit. Now, after multiple repetitions of this after a period of 2 weeks, what was found was that the rat, which is the same as the neutral stimulus, was a conditioned stimulus and produced a conditioned response of fear. In fact, it was demonstrated that through classical conditioning, phobias could be developed based upon associations between an unconditioned stimulus and a neutral stimulus. This phobia was then generalized to other objects that could be associated with the characteristics of the rat in the first place, such as a Father Christmas mask and also the family dog, thus demonstrating that not only could classical conditioning produce phobias, but it could also lead to further phobias being developed as a result. Now, operant conditioning can be seen within the study as well, as whenever Albert was presented with the rat, he would also try and get away from it to avoid the aversive stimuli. This is Albert trying to perform negative reinforcement, as he is attempting to remove a stimuli from the environment. And in fact, in a later video where we discuss phobias, I shall be talking you through the Maurer 2 process model, which states that phobias are developed by classical conditioning and maintained by operant conditioning. But for now, that is the main assumptions of behavioral psychology that you need to know. Be sure to read any guidance provided to you by your tutors and look at the assignment and resources that you can find on the online systems. Don't forget to do your own independent research, as it's very important that you understand the subject matter, and these videos are just designed to help you through and provide a little bit more understanding on how these certain assumptions would explain human behavior. That is all from me. Thank you for watching, and I shall see you in the next video.